My name is Isaura. I'm 22 years old and I need you to look at me. Really look at me before I tell you what was done to me. My hands are pale as winter milk. My voice was trained to sing Schubert. I speak French with an accent that would make Parisian ladies nod in approval. And yet, for most of my life, I was property. Not a woman. Not a person. Property. Listed in ledgers between livestock and silver candlesticks. Assigned a price. Branded by a law that looked at my mother's blood and decided that no matter how white my skin appeared, I belonged to a man who saw me as something to be broken and owned. I was a slave who looked like a lady, and that contradiction nearly destroyed me, and nearly got me killed. If this already touched something deep inside you, if you know what it feels like to be seen as less than you truly are, please take 1 second and hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing, but for my family it means everything. It helps put food on our table and keeps these stories alive for people who need to hear them. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one. And if this story moves you, please give it a like. You have no idea how much that simple gesture matters to a family like mine. Now, stay with me. Because what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about my own life. But before I tell you how I escaped, 3 times, before I tell you about the man who first offered me something I had never been given before, dignity, before I tell you about the woman who was supposed to be my enemy, but became the key to my freedom, I need you to understand something. There is a document, a single piece of paper, folded inside a dead man's coat, that changed everything I thought I knew about my own life. A truth so buried, so deliberately hidden from me, that when I finally held it in my trembling hands, I could not breathe. Not from sorrow, from rage, because I had suffered for years, for something that was already mine. The house where I grew up smelled of beeswax candles and orange blossom water. Donna Maria kept the floors so polished you could see your own reflection looking back at you, distorted and uncertain, much like I always felt inside those walls. The windows were tall and dressed in ivory lace, and in the mornings, the light came through them in long golden columns that touched the piano keys like something sacred. From the outside, it looked like a place where only grace and refinement lived. The gardens were trimmed with obsessive care. The dining table was always set with imported china. Everything about that house whispered of civilization, of taste, of a world where beauty was protected. I learned, very slowly, that beauty in that house was only protected when it was useful to someone else. My days were measured in lessons and silence. I woke before the sun, practiced piano scales until my fingers ached, then moved to French grammar, then to embroidery. Silk thread pulled through linen so fine it was nearly transparent. I ate separately from the field workers, but was never fully welcomed at the main table either. I existed in a threshold, too refined for the quarters, too stained by blood for the parlour. Donna Maria was kind, in the way that people are kind when kindness costs them nothing. She dressed me well, taught me to read, called me her little treasure. But she never once said the word that mattered. She never said free. And I was too young then to understand that treasure and property can mean the same thing to the person who holds the key. The wound I carried was not made of iron or whip marks. It was made of mirrors. Every morning I looked at my reflection and saw a woman who, by every visible measure, should have been free. My skin, my speech, my education, none of it pointed to chains. And yet the chains were there, invisible to strangers, absolutely real to me. My mother, Juliana, had been taken from the house before I was old enough to remember her face clearly. I was left with the ghost of her, the whisper that she had been beautiful, that a powerful man had loved her in the way powerful men love things they want to possess. I grew up knowing I was the result of that love, and knowing that the same world that produced me had decided, without asking, that I would carry her fate. Not his name, not his freedom. Only her chains. The day Donna Maria died, it rained without stopping. I remember standing at the window watching the garden drown, the trimmed hedges bending under the weight of water, the orange blossoms torn from their branches and pressed flat into the mud. She passed quietly in the early hours, with her rosary laced between her fingers. By noon, the house already felt different, like air had been pulled from every room. By evening, Leôncio arrived. I heard his boots on the polished floor before I saw him. Heavy, deliberate steps. The kind of steps that announce ownership. He stood in the doorway of the music room where I sat frozen at the piano, and he looked at me the way a man looks at something he has been waiting a long time to claim. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The inventory of the estate had already begun, and I was on it. I had two choices, and I understood them both with a clarity that was almost calm. I could lower my eyes, fold my hands, become invisible, survive by making myself small enough that his appetite might pass over me like a storm over flat ground. Or I could refuse. Not with violence, not with screaming. I had no power for that. But with the one thing still entirely mine, my silence, my stillness, the absolute refusal to pretend that what he wanted was anything other than monstrous. I chose refusal. I held his gaze across that room for 3 full seconds. 3 seconds that cost me everything and gave me the only thing worth keeping, the knowledge that I had not surrendered myself. He smiled when I finally looked away, a slow, patient smile. The smile of a man who believes that time is always on his side. Within a week, my room was changed. The ivory lace curtains were gone. The small bookshelf Donna Maria had given me, with its French novels and its worn Bible, was removed. A lock appeared on the outside of my door. It was never spoken of directly. No orders were shouted, no explanations given. That was the most frightening part. The cruelty came wrapped in perfect silence, in small architectural changes, in the way the household staff stopped meeting my eyes at breakfast. I was being quietly, methodically reduced. He was not breaking me with violence, not yet. He was dismantling the version of me that believed she had value, piece by piece, the way you strip a house down to its bare walls before deciding what to do with the structure. And somewhere in those first cold nights, listening to the lock click from the outside, I made myself a promise. I would not be here when he finished. The first time I ran, I had nothing but a borrowed dress, a false name, and the address of a music teacher in a city 3 days away. I called myself Elvira. I told people I was a widow from the interior, recently orphaned, looking for honest work. For 4 months, I taught piano to the daughters of merchants, small hands stumbling over Mozart while I sat beside them counting measures and pretending that my heart was not constantly listening for the sound of boots on cobblestone. I slept in a narrow room above a bakery. The smell of bread in the mornings felt like mercy. I started to believe, foolishly, that distance was the same as freedom, that if enough miles separated me from Leôncio, his claim on me would dissolve like sugar in warm water. I was wrong. Hatred, I would learn, has longer legs than hope. At night, when the city settled into its ordinary darkness, I would lie awake and ask myself questions I had no answers for. Was I a coward for running instead of fighting? Was I selfish for building a quiet life while others like me remained behind locked doors? I thought about my mother constantly in those months. Juliana, whose face I could barely reconstruct from memory, whose voice I had never truly known. I wondered if she had ever felt this particular terror, the terror of almost being free. Because that is its own kind of torment. When you have tasted something close to dignity, the thought of losing it again does not feel like going backward. It feels like dying. I prayed in that small room above the bakery. I prayed with the desperate specificity of someone who has run out of every other option. And for a while, I almost believed something was listening. He found me on a Tuesday. I remember because the merchant's youngest daughter had just learned to play the opening bars of a minuet without stopping, and I had felt, for one brief and luminous moment, genuinely proud. Then I looked up and saw the two men standing in the doorway of the parlour. They wore no uniforms, carried no papers visibly, but I knew. The body knows before the mind does. My hands went cold on the keys. The little girl kept playing, oblivious, her small fingers moving carefully over the notes while the room collapsed around me. I stood slowly, the way you stand when you are trying to convince your legs not to run, because running would only make it faster and worse. One of the men smiled. The other did not bother. They had done this before. I was not the first woman they had returned like lost luggage to a waiting master. They transported me in a covered carriage with the curtains drawn. My wrists were not bound. Leôncio had instructed them to bring me back without visible marks, I would later understand, because damaged property loses value. The road back was 3 days of silence and the smell of leather and tobacco, and my own fear sweating through the borrowed dress. When we arrived, Leôncio was waiting on the front steps with his hands clasped behind his back, as composed as a man greeting expected guests. He said nothing as I was brought inside. Nothing that night, nothing the next morning. The silence was the punishment. He locked me in a room with no windows and left me there for 9 days, with enough food to survive, and nothing else. No light, no sound, no clock, no way to measure time except by hunger. 9 days to understand, he intended, that the world outside that room existed only because he permitted it. By the 9th day, something in me had either broken or hardened. I still do not know which word is more honest. I sat on the stone floor with my back against the wall, and I took inventory of what remained. My body was weakened, but intact. My mind was still mine, barely, but mine. And somewhere beneath the hunger and the darkness and the humiliation, there was a small, stubborn, almost unreasonable thing that refused to go out entirely. Not hope, exactly. Hope felt too bright a word for what lived in me then. It was closer to refusal. A refusal so quiet and so deep it required no voice, no plan, no audience. Just the fact of it, burning low like an ember under ash, waiting. When the door finally opened and the light hit my face, I did not flinch. I looked directly at him. And I think, for the first time, he saw something in my eyes that genuinely unsettled him. The second time I escaped, I was smarter. I moved at night, changed directions twice, and travelled with a group of pilgrims heading north, hidden beneath a heavy wool cloak despite the summer heat. That was when I met Álvaro. Not in the romantic way stories are told, with soft light and easy words. I met him exhausted, mud-stained, and trembling at the edge of a river crossing, trying to decide if the current was too strong to attempt alone. He was on the opposite bank. He saw me hesitate, and without a single question, he waded back across and offered me his hand. Not to possess, not to rescue in the way men rescue things they intend to keep. Simply to help me cross. I had never in my life been offered help that asked for nothing in return, and I did not know how to receive it. I stood there with his hand extended toward me, and I wept. Not from sadness, but from the sheer unfamiliar weight of being treated as fully human. It was Alvaro who found the letter. We had been together for 3 months, careful, quiet months in a small town where nobody asked too many questions. When he came home one evening with a leather satchel and a look on his face I had never seen before, grave and tender at the same time. He had been making inquiries, he told me softly, into my father's estate records. What he found stopped the air in the room entirely. A letter of manumission, a formal document of emancipation, signed in my father's own hand on the night before he died, years before Leôncio had ever set eyes on me. My freedom had been granted, documented, legally sealed, and someone had buried it deliberately, folded it inside a coat, locked inside a chest, inside a house where I was never meant to look. I had been a free woman the entire time. Every chain, every locked room, every mile of desperate running, all of it built on a lie that someone had chosen, carefully and consciously, to maintain. The document in my hands was both everything and nothing at the same time. Everything, because it was proof, legal and undeniable, that my freedom had existed long before I had bled for it. Nothing, because Leôncio still had men, money, and influence thick as roots under every courthouse in the region. Alvaro laid out the options carefully, the way a man does when he loves someone enough to be honest instead of comforting. We could flee again, further this time, north beyond his reach, build a quiet life under false names and pray the document was never needed. Safe, perhaps. But a life lived in permanent hiding is its own kind of captivity, and I had already served that sentence. Or we could walk into a courthouse and place that letter before a judge, in full daylight, with Leôncio's name spoken aloud, and risk everything on the belief that the law, which had failed me so completely before, might this time be forced to honor what was written in its own language. Neither choice was safe. Only one was true. I chose the courthouse, and in making that choice I finally understood who I had been all along. Beneath the borrowed dresses and the false names and the 9 days of darkness and the tears at river crossings, I was not a woman defined by what had been done to her. I was a woman defined by what she refused to accept. There was fear, absolutely. My hands shook the entire night before we went, and I did not sleep, and I prayed with every prayer I had ever learned in every language I had been taught. But underneath the fear was something that felt almost like peace, because I was no longer running away from something. For the first time in my life, I was walking toward something, toward my own name, spoken in public, acknowledged by law, witnessed by strangers who would have to look at me and see not property, not contradiction, not a problem to be managed, but a person. Isaura. Fully, finally, irreversibly, a person. The morning we walked into that courthouse, Leôncio was already there. Someone had warned him, I never discovered who, and he stood in the corridor with 2 lawyers flanking him like columns, his face arranged into the particular expression of a man who has never once been told no by any institution that mattered. When he saw me, something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise, something closer to fury wrapped in composure, the way a fire looks contained behind glass, still dangerous, still hungry, simply temporarily enclosed. He looked at Alvaro with open contempt, then back at me with something I can only describe as possessive disbelief, the expression of a man who cannot reconcile the woman standing before him with the girl he had locked in a windowless room. I held his gaze. My hands were still. My voice, when the judge asked me to state my name, came out clear and level and entirely my own. I said, "My name is Isaura, and I have a document that belongs to me." What saved me in that room was not drama. It was paper and ink, and the signature of a dead man who had, in his final hours, chosen to do one right thing. The judge reviewed the manumission letter in silence for a long time, long enough that I counted my own heartbeats to stay calm. Leôncio's lawyers argued loudly about dates and jurisdictions and the validity of documents found outside official registry. And then Malvina walked in, his own wife, pale, composed, dressed in black as though already mourning something, carrying a second document she had retrieved from a chest she had no legal right to open, but had opened anyway. A witness statement from a notary, confirming the letter's authenticity, signed the same night as my father's death. The room went very quiet. Leôncio turned to look at her with an expression I will carry with me until I die. The look of a man who finally understands that the walls he built to contain others have become his own prison. The judge's decision took 11 minutes. I counted those too. That was years ago now. I still wake some mornings with my heart racing, reaching for a door I'm afraid will be locked from the outside. And then I feel the open air, the unlocked room, Alvaro's steady breathing beside me. And I remember. I remember that freedom is not a destination you arrive at once and keep forever without effort. It is something you choose, again and again. Every morning you decide to live honestly and without apology. I think about Malvina, who chose truth over loyalty to a man who had never deserved either. I think about my mother, Juliana, who never had a courthouse or a letter or a hand extended across a river. And I carry her with me into every room I enter freely. I think about the little girl learning Mozart while the world collapsed around her teacher, and I hope she grew up in a world with fewer locked doors. My name is Isaura. I was 3 times a fugitive, once a piece of property, and for one long, terrible season, a woman who almost forgot her own worth. I did not forget, and neither should you.